Jason Cole was a 24-year-old African-American medical student from Atlanta who, in the summer of 1999, traveled to Ghana on a heritage research grant. His trip was deeply personal, motivated by the recent death of his grandmother, Evelyn Cole, who had raised him after his mother died young. Evelyn had always avoided questions about their African ancestry, and her sudden passing left behind a sealed wooden box containing a folded piece of parchment and a handwritten letter. The letter was cryptic, a short list of names, coordinates to a village not found on any map, and a final line scribbled in what looked like panicked handwriting. Never enter the forest at night, and if you're invited to a circle, refuse. Jason, curious and rational to a fault, viewed the warning as nothing more than an emotional metaphor, a dramatic way for his grandmother to send him off with mystery. But the names in the letter, the odd symbols carved into the wood, and the location of the village called Ijuum gnawed at him. As a future doctor, Jason had an analytical mind and no belief in the supernatural, but something about this felt deeper than myth. 2 months later, he booked a flight to Accra, Ghana, determined to trace the truth. Upon arriving, he discovered that even locals were hesitant to speak of Ijuum. The closer he came to the coordinates in the letter, the more resistance he met. Drivers turned him away. Villagers gave vague warnings. In Takoradi, an older man heard the name Ijuum and muttered a proverb under his breath. Some places still remember the old gods. Eventually, through the help of a translator and a generous bribe, Jason reached the edge of the Nkasa Forest Reserve. From there, he walked a dirt path carved into thick foliage until he came upon Ijuum, a cluster of earthen huts surrounded by dense trees and a strange, almost audible stillness in the air. The village was unlike anything he'd seen. Women carried bundles of herbs strung with bones. Children played silently, eyes wary of the woods. Above many doorways hung red cloth strips, some new, some faded and worn. When he introduced himself and showed them the letter, most turned away. Only one man acknowledged him, Kojo Mensa, a gray-eyed elder who said he had once been Evelyn's cousin. Kojo lived in a circular hut on the village's northern edge, near the trees locals avoided after sundown. Kojo welcomed Jason and offered him a mat to sleep on, though his demeanor remained guarded. He warned Jason not to speak the names written in the letter aloud. "Your grandmother left for a reason," Kojo said, "and she stayed away for even better ones." But Jason needed answers. For days, he explored the village and attempted to connect with its people. Most ignored him, but an elderly woman named Ajoa told him in broken English that the forest carried memories. She warned him about the circle of blood and those who never stopped listening. She claimed that Evelyn had once stood at the forest's edge and spoken the unspeakable, an act that forced her to leave and never return. Each night, Jason had vivid dreams. He saw his grandmother barefoot in a circle of stone, surrounded by tall figures in red cloth. Her mouth bled, and her eyes stared straight through him. She spoke one word repeatedly, a whisper that lodged deep in his brain, Accommodant. When Jason said the word out loud at Kojo's dinner table, the reaction was immediate. Utensils clattered. Kojo's hand slammed the table. His voice turned cold. "You don't know what you've invited." The villagers, already distant, became openly hostile. They no longer spoke to him. His presence felt cursed. That night, Jason heard a knock, not at the door, but on the thin window pane next to his mat. 3 slow, deliberate taps. He opened the door to find the village path marked with a thin trail of ash and white feathers, leading toward the forbidden edge of the forest. When he asked Kojo the next morning, the old man was gone. His hut was empty, swept clean, as if no one had ever lived there. The villagers pretended not to know him. Desperate and confused, Jason followed the ash trail that evening, deeper into the forest than he had ever dared to go. As twilight turned to night, the trees grew impossibly dense. Still, he felt compelled forward, like something beyond his will guided his feet. Eventually, he reached a clearing bathed in moonlight. There, 9 robed figures stood barefoot in a perfect circle. Their faces were hidden by crimson cloth. In the center sat a wide bowl filled with steaming red liquid. One of them stepped forward and said, in Jason's voice, "The blood knows you. Speak the oath or be taken by silence." Jason felt a pressure in his chest, and his mouth moved without consent. He uttered words in a language that felt older than anything he'd ever read. When the last syllable left his lips, the bowl caught fire, the figures bowed, and Jason collapsed. He awoke alone near the edge of the village. His clothes were soaked, but not from sweat or rain. A sour scent clung to him. He stumbled into Ijuim to find his hut burned to the ground. Villagers screamed when they saw him and hid their children. Only the elder approached him, placing a torn bus ticket in his hand. "The oath was taken," the man said. "The price is your shadow." Jason didn't understand. He barely remembered the night before. He boarded a bus back to Takoradi the next day and eventually flew home to Atlanta, determined to put everything behind him. But what came back with him didn't stay in Ghana. At first, it was subtle. Lights flickered when he entered rooms. Electronics malfunctioned in his presence. He'd glance in mirrors and see his reflection blink out of sync. Jason began to suffer from insomnia. When he did sleep, he woke up with soil under his fingernails, bruises on his arms and feet. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like wind under a door, then more distinct. A voice, always female, always saying the same thing. "Finish the circle." His roommate Marcus laughed it off, until he heard Jason muttering a commandant in his sleep. One night, Jason awoke to find Marcus standing over him with tears in his eyes. "You were speaking, and something was answering." The next morning, Marcus was gone. His room was untouched, his phone and wallet still on the desk. Police investigated, but found no sign of forced entry or struggle. The only unusual detail, a pattern of black ash arranged in a spiral under Marcus's bed. Jason sought help, psychologists, priests, shamans. He traveled to New Orleans and spoke to a respected root doctor named Delafontaine. The moment Jason spoke the words from the ritual, she began to chant and burn sage, instructing him to leave immediately. She told him he had spoken with the old ones, and that his blood was no longer clean. Every expert said something similar. He had entered a pact older than religion, and there was no way to sever the bond. One priest said, "The oath marked you. You're not just haunted, you've been claimed." In 2003, Jason vanished for 3 days. His car was found parked outside a closed church on the outskirts of Atlanta. When he returned, he wouldn't speak of where he had gone. But his appearance had changed. His fingernails had turned black. Deep symmetrical cuts adorned his arms. He flinched at sunlight and insisted on keeping the apartment dark. He began drawing obsessively, circles within circles, faces with hollow eyes, trees that bled. He once carved a sigil into his own skin, and when asked why, he said, "To finish the path." He stopped working, stopped calling friends. Eventually, Jason was found barefoot at 3 a.m. in a major Atlanta intersection, surrounded by dead birds arranged in a perfect spiral. He was admitted to Grady Memorial's psychiatric unit. Over the next 3 nights, every clock in the facility froze at 3:33 a.m. Nurses reported hearing murmurs in empty rooms. Jason never spoke until the 3rd night, when he whispered to a night nurse, "If you dream of the red circle, wake up before it completes." He died in 2006. Official cause, cardiac arrest. But during the autopsy, the coroner noted something inexplicable. Jason's heart had physically shrunk, as though compressed from within. His eyes, according to the report, were unnaturally dilated and appeared to be smiling. The coroner, in a handwritten margin note, scribbled only, "This one felt wrong." His funeral was sparsely attended. Some person who did attend reported the same dream that night. In it, they stood in a forest clearing under a full moon, surrounded by 9 red-robed figures. Jason stood at the center, eyes bleeding, mouth sewn shut. One figure whispered into each mourner's ear. None of the attendees have ever spoken of it publicly. One moved out of state. Another became reclusive. But a nurse from the hospital, now living in Arizona, claims Jason appears to her dream, once a year on the anniversary of his death, at exactly 3:33 a.m. He never speaks. He only stares. And just before he fades, he whispers the word she can never forget, "Accommodant." When Whale was just 7 years old, he drowned for 3 minutes in the Osun River in southwestern Nigeria. He had been playing on the banks with cousins during a family visit to Osogbo when he slipped on a moss-covered stone and fell. He didn't remember much, just the weightlessness, the sound of water like static, and a voice, female but not human, whispering a lullaby he couldn't understand. His grandmother, Mama Iridi, later told him he'd been borrowed by the river, and returned only because the Osun deity had taken a liking to him. What Whale didn't know then was that a pact had been made that day. One Mama Iridi would seal 10 years later in a secret, desperate ritual to save him from death. Years passed. Whale's parents moved to the Bronx, New York, when he was 10, leaving Osogbo and all its spiritual roots behind. Or so they thought. But Whale began suffering strange illnesses as a teenager. Fevers without infection, sudden paralysis, and nightmares of being underwater. Doctors were baffled. Mama Iridi, still in Nigeria, knew the truth. Osun was calling for what was promised, a marriage. And the deadline was near. When Whale turned 17, Mama Iridi arranged a trip back to Nigeria under the guise of reconnecting with family. But on his third night in Osogbo, she took him deep into the forest near the Osun sacred grove. There, in a moonlit clearing by the riverbank, the ceremony was held. Whale, confused and weak from fever, stood barefoot in white cloth as a priestess chanted in Yoruba and women danced in circles, pouring palm oil and goat blood into the water. Then came the bridal veil, woven from reeds and river pearls, and it was placed over Whale's head. The last thing he saw before fainting was a tall woman with silver eyes rising from the water. When he awoke, he was healthy, strong. The fever was gone. Mama Iridi wept with joy. She told him the goddess had accepted him as her husband, and he was bound for life. Whale returned to New York healthier than he'd ever been. For years, life seemed to flourish. He earned a scholarship, studied architecture, and never got sick again. But at night, he dreamed of the river. In his sleep, he saw the same tall figure watching from the water, never speaking, always veiled. As he matured, Whale chalked it up to childhood trauma, until he met Tasha in his final year of college. She was bold, radiant, and unapologetically in love with him. Their connection was instant. But 3 months into their relationship, Whale's nightmares changed. The veiled figure now stood over his bed. His sheets were wet in the mornings, sometimes muddy. One night, he found river reeds wrapped around his feet. Then Tasha began to suffer, nausea, fainting spells, phantom scratches across her back, and waking up screaming after seeing a woman with silver eyes standing by her window. A friend suggested a deliverance church, but when Whale brought Tasha there, the pastor took one look at him and whispered, "Something has married you." Terrified, Whale called his grandmother. Mama Iridi sobbed on the phone and finally confessed everything: the drowning, the pact, the midnight wedding. She had bargained with the Osun priestesses to save him, giving the goddess his life, his body, and his loyalty. Tasha, she said, was now seen as a threat, but Whale refused to believe it. He confronted his grandmother, who warned, "If you leave the goddess, she will take something from you." That night, he had a dream where the veiled bride finally lifted her covering, and beneath it was Tasha's face, bleeding from the mouth, whispering, "You swore forever." Desperate, Whale sought help from a priest in Brooklyn, who confirmed the bond. "You are hers. Your body walks in this world, but your spirit sleeps in the river," the priest said. Breaking the bond would require a blood price and an exile ritual. Tasha insisted they go through with it. On the day of the ritual, held in a secret basement temple in the Bronx, Whale sat in a circle of salt and cowrie shells. Chickens were sacrificed, incantations chanted. As the priest burned river herbs, the basement flooded, water pouring in from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Everyone fled except Whale and Tasha. She clung to him, begging him to speak the severing words, but when he opened his mouth, he began to choke. His eyes rolled back, and he spoke in a woman's voice. He was mine first. Whale survived, but Tasha disappeared. The police investigated her as a missing person, but no one ever found a trace. Her phone was left on Whale's kitchen counter, soaked in water. Months passed. Whale stopped speaking. He quit school. Neighbors began reporting a strange figure in his apartment window at night. A tall woman with a veil, just standing still. He moved several times, but each new place smelled of river water within days. Finally, Whale left the U.S. entirely, returning to Osogbo in silence. Rumor says he lives in a hut near the sacred grove, speaking to no one, except at midnight when villagers hear him singing an old lullaby to the river. Some say the Osun goddess claimed him completely. Others say he's still half here, half in the river world. But those who dream of the veiled bride, always standing by a river, always silent, wake up soaked to the bone and swearing they heard her say, "My groom will never leave,"